Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted for the first in our series on resetting the relationship. We are joined by the Right Honourable David Jones. David, you were fundamental in Vote Leave's campaign, leading that in Wales. You are a former Secretary of State for Wales and crucially were a minister in the exiting the European Union department during those Brexit negotiations. And today you serve as an advisor to Reform UK and were obviously instrumental in helping put together their Welsh election manifesto. So thank you for joining us.
It's very good to be here, Tom.
Super. And to put this series in context, so last week we saw the 10-year anniversary of the Brexit referendum. That obviously fundamentally changed the UK's relationship with Europe. It's also helped to reshape UK politics going forward. But David, 10 years on, we're obviously in a different place. Geopolitics is once again reshaping our relationship with Europe. And the new Labour government and indeed the likely new Labour Prime Minister are seeking once again ever closer alignment with Europe. But just as kind of we get to that point and looking back really at the subsequent negotiations to leave the European Union and thinking about what negotiations might occur between the government today and the European Union, what were some of those difficulties that were faced from the UK side in terms of negotiating with the European Union on its departure?
Well, Tom, there were a lot of difficulties. Some of them were within the British government and the British administration, and also external from the European Union. And I think that the most immediate problem that we had was that it became very clear shortly after the vote that most of the political establishment, most of the administrative establishment in this country didn't really want Brexit at all. And we immediately started talking about what should Brexit look like, what sort of Brexit should it be. And that, of course, is something that dominated the next few years. And the other problem that we had was that literally no preparation had been made by the British government or the British civil service for Brexit. It was widely assumed that the British people would reject it. And in fact, the government was actually helping to push that along by, if you recall, sending a leaflet at public expense to every home in the country at the cost of over £9 million, essentially saying, not in so many words, why we should vote to remain in the European Union. So it came as a huge surprise to the establishment in this country that we voted to leave. Externally, it was a problem too. The European Union were absolutely appalled at what had happened. There was a great sense of shock and disbelief. For example, shortly after I was appointed a minister, I was asked if I would see a former Scandinavian prime minister urgently. And we went for a coffee together. And this gentleman said to me, I've come here for reassurance. He said, I want reassurance that you will not actually be leaving the European Union. I said, well, yes, we will. We've just voted to do so. And he said, oh, well, don't worry about that. He said, that's merely advisory. He said, you can ignore all that. He said, don't you realize what a disaster this will be for the EU? Don't you realize that the UK holds the balance between Germany and France? It will cause a huge imbalance within the EU. And ultimately, I told him, having bought him a coffee, that there was going to be no question of our not leaving the European Union. So really, I think it was a question of attitude, it was a question of lack of preparedness, and it was a question of positive hostility on the part of members of the European Union who really wanted us to remain.
And at that time, obviously, it was the Commission that were pushing the negotiations from the European side. But did you have any sort of bilaterals, or was there any sideline negotiations with the member states in trying to kind of move that negotiation forward and using those relationships as well?
Yeah, yes, we did a lot of that. I used to attend all the General Affairs Councils every month. In fact, the first one I attended was shortly after the presidency of the council had passed to Slovakia, and the council was meeting in Bratislava. It was then that it became very apparent to me that it wasn't going down too well. I met a very senior European commissioner who shook my hand and said, "Well, Mr. Jones, how long do you intend to remain shackled to this corpse?" So I got the impression from that he wasn't really welcoming what we were doing. So we did decide that a good idea was to have bilateral discussions with our opposite numbers. I spoke to most of them. Most of them were very courteous. Some of them were extremely courteous, and it became obvious to me that they wanted to see some form of modernization of the European Union and a loosening of the European Union. And it was very difficult to speak to one or two of my opposite numbers, and I'll leave it up to you to guess. But it was an important part of the exercise, and these did prove fruitful later because we opened avenues of communication that otherwise we might not have been able to.
No, thank you. That's really interesting. And I think later on we'll sort of touch on what comes next and perhaps how those relationships that we've built since in member states might be particularly useful. But just kind of touching on that point you were saying around the obstacles that you faced both on both sides of the channel, I think we can say. Obviously, the negotiations took considerable time and political capital. We had changes of prime minister on this side of the channel. We had a general election during that time. Are there any things other than that sort of, I suppose, the piece you were saying around preparing for Brexit from the civil service perspective? But are there any things that you think the UK government could have done or should have done differently in terms of reaching that final settlement and whether there should have been further asks or uh, concessions on either side in that settlement?
I think that the British government actually found itself going down a blind alley over Ireland. I think that that was the biggest problem. It became very clear early in the negotiations that the European Union were going to raise the issue of a hard border in Ireland as a strong negotiating point. I think that we actually fell for that. And in fact, if you reflect on what was being said at the time, the British Prime Minister, the Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, and the President of the Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, had all said that in no circumstances would there be a hard border in Ireland. And yet, despite that, we spent years literally arguing about whether or not there would be one and trying to find a way around it. And of course, the consequence of this was the Northern Ireland Protocol, which subsequently morphed into the Windsor Framework, which is still causing problems because it means that an important part of the United Kingdom hasn't fully left the European Union. It's still subject to European law in some respects and also to the European Union's diktats. So I think that that was a big mistake. I think that if we'd been a lot bolder and had said we don't believe that there will ever be a border in Ireland, we don't believe that anyone wants it, you've said as much, and just negotiated on that line, we would probably have got a lot further and got a far swifter resolution.
No, that's really interesting. And I know later on in this series, we'll be speaking to colleagues in Northern Ireland and also in Irish government as they take forward the forthcoming presidency of the European Union. So it'll be interesting to touch on that with them, no doubt, in a bit more detail.
Yes.
Um, but just thinking around today, really, and let's say we are now 10 years on from that referendum. We are looking ahead to a supposed UK EU summit later this summer. And we have a government that is seemingly committed to a closer relationship with the European Union again. Um, on the background to that, obviously, we've seen the geopolitical situation change with attitudes perhaps here in the UK shifting closer to Europe as the US withdraws from some of those traditional alliances and traditional roles that it's played. How do you see our relationship with Europe changing going forward, and what impact do you think the government's stance and whichever new prime minister we have, the new prime minister's stance, and also that public opinion shifting? I know we've sort of seen opinion polls on Brexit remain fairly stable, but that there is a broader move towards a more positive attitude towards Europe as opposed to the European Union on a whole.
Well, I don't think anybody thinks it's a bad idea to have a good relationship with the European Union. I mean, it's our immediate neighbour, it's a trading partner, and it will that will remain whether or not we are part of it. I think that people really should reflect on the fact that the reason that we voted to leave the European Union was because we wanted to reclaim sovereignty and we didn't want the United Kingdom to be subject to the directions of a foreign administration or to the jurisdiction of a foreign court. We felt that it was right that we should be governing ourselves. So once that's dealt with, then of course we should try to have as good a relationship with the European Union as possible. What disturbs me at the moment is that the current Labour government appears to be wanting to increasingly to adopt EU regulations and to seek a close alignment, which will mean that we will be indirectly once again subject to European law and the administration of European law without actually asking the British public about it. There is no mandate, for example, for joining the single market or the customs union, but what the Labour government is doing at the moment looks very much like that. So I actually think that we need to be very bold about this too. I think we need to tell the European Union that, you know, whilst we don't want to be governed by them anymore, we do want to be as close to them as possible. You mentioned defence. That is an extremely important element. At the moment, it looks as if President Trump wants to withdraw from NATO to a greater or a lesser extent. With President Trump, you never know what extent that is. But if that is the case, then certainly Europe should be doing more to defend itself. And certainly the United Kingdom needs to be very actively participating with the European Union, provided, you know, we understand that it's part of a military alliance and not part of the arrangements of the political arrangements of the European Union. So I think that we need to be grown up about this. Yes, we can have good relations with the EU. Yes, we can participate with them in military activities and so on. But it's a very, very different thing from rejoining the European Union, which is, in fact, what this current government is seeking to do by the back door.
And we have already seen, I think for the first time, the UK voluntarily giving up its freedom to make rules in certain areas. And one of the key negotiations ongoing at the minute is with regards to an SPS agreement covering food, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, etc. The government and the European Union are presenting that obviously as part of the solution to the issues around the Windsor framework that we touched on earlier. But it's interesting to see the reaction from both stakeholders here in the UK, some who are in favour, some who are virulently against, and also the political parties. And you seem to have sort of both ends on the right and the left being somewhat critical of SPS, whether it's for the use of pesticides that are perhaps permitted in the EU but not permitted here in the UK, or vice versa, or whether it's on issues related to food labelling. And it almost seems to me that it's fascinating, whereas traditionally Brexit may have been seen as sort of an issue of the right, whereas you have got this coalescence, both right and left, coming out against those repatriation of powers back to Europe, in spite of perhaps their own position on broader relationships with the European Union.
Yes, well, of course, there has always been this dichotomy. I mean, the right and the left have never had a completely uniform attitude to Brexit. I mean, you know, I'm always happy to take credit as one of the Spartans for ensuring that that Theresa May's agreement with the EU didn't go through. We mustn't forget the fact that we wouldn't have done that if we'd not had the assistance of Jeremy Corbyn. So, it's never been a uniform thing on the right or the left. But I think that the concern about SPS, which is, I think, a very good example of the concerns we have generally, is that if we do have the so-called closer relationship that this government is looking for, we in this country will be signing up to EU regulations. Which means in turn that we'll be signing up to the jurisdiction indirect of the European Court of Justice. And this is something that we need to be very careful of, not simply from the point of view of sovereignty and constitutional independence, but also in practical terms. I mean, if you look back, for example, to the COVID pandemic, the United Kingdom, outside the European Union, was far faster in developing a vaccine and rolling out the vaccine than the EU, which has got a very clunky, slow regulatory process. And my concern is that pharmaceutical products, which are a big export industry for this country, we're talking about 11 billion pounds per annum, may well find itself hobbled by having to accede to EU regulations. There is no reason at all why, if we want to sell into the European Union, we shouldn't adopt their regulations. We obviously have to do so. Similarly, if we're selling to the US or to any other country in the world, we have to make sure that our products accord with their regulations. That's one thing. It's an entirely different thing to say that we've got to sign up to the laws and regulations imposed by an overseas jurisdiction.
No, thank you. Really good point. And thinking ahead to the potential UK-EU summit, and we will see whether that goes ahead later this summer. Do you think that sort of marks the first real review period of the Brexit settlement as was? Do you think we'll see any material changes to that settlement coming out of that review?
Well, I think there will be changes. In fact, there have been changes already since we entered into our initial agreement with the European Union. Ron Davies, the former Secretary of State for Wales, once memorably said that devolution is not an event, it's a process. And similarly, one could say that our relations with the European Union is not an event encapsulated in Brexit. That's a process too. I think that what we have to be very wary of, again, as I say, is the United Kingdom finding itself acceding to European regulations by the back door. I don't think anybody really wants that. But most importantly of all, this government has not got a mandate to do that. And, if they want to deepen the relationship to the extent of signing up to the procedures of the European Union, then with a new prime minister in the offing, maybe it would be a good idea to have a general election where we can argue about that during the campaign.
Sure, that's a topic for our next series of webinars, no doubt. Just
Happy to
picking
help
up,
out then if you like.
just picking up on your point around devolution. Actually, I thought that was really interesting. And looking back to your position as the Welsh lead for Vote Leave, but also your time as Secretary of State for Wales. What impact do you think Brexit has had both on Welsh politics in general, but also on the devolution settlement here in the UK?
I mean, this is a very interesting discussion generally, and I could spend hours on it. But um, I think we have to start by remembering that Wales voted more enthusiastically for Brexit than the United Kingdom as a whole. There was in Brexit terms, there was a significant majority to leave, which I think came as a huge surprise to the powers that be in Cardiff. In fact, nearly all of Wales, apart from metropolitan Cardiff, voted to leave the European Union. Now, that is, I think, something that is continuing to have repercussions to this day. The Welsh elections, which took place only last month, saw reform come from literally nowhere, zero members, to 34 out of 96. At the same time, the Labour Party, which had been in control in Cardiff ever since devolution was implemented, were reduced to 10 seats. The Conservatives down to 7 seats. And I think that what this shows is an increasing polarization now between Reform on the one hand and Plaid Cymru on the other. And Plaid Cymru, as an established party, of course, did actually get the biggest share of the vote. Um, and the older parties becoming increasingly irrelevant. And really, this is something I would have thought that the Labour Party should be reflecting on when it decides that it really wants to edge closer to the European Union. In the devolved areas of the United Kingdom, that wouldn't appear to be that popular. They, of course, were reduced in Scotland to a similar number of MSPs as Reform. In fact, exactly the same number. And given that Nick Thomas Symonds is presently, at least until Andy Burnham appoints his ministerial team, is the minister who is responsible for relations with the European Union and is himself Welsh, he really, I would have thought, should be learning the lessons of becoming too close to the European Union.
And I think that's a really interesting point around the impact that Brexit's still having really on the established parties. And I take it from your answer there that you think the impact perhaps on Labour has been less in terms of their thinking and where the party is and more on their voter base. But perhaps looking at the Conservatives in particular and the impact that Brexit has had on where they sit and how they position themselves. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that it's still a problem for the Conservative Party. Europe has been the fault line within the Conservative Party for a very long time. And of course, it became absolutely open during the parliamentary campaign to get out of the EU. I mean, for example, the attitude of people such as Oliver Letwin, Dominic Grieve, and so on was diametrically opposed to people such as Marc-Francois Bilcash and indeed me. It became open and apparent. And I think that this is something that the Conservative Party is still coming to terms with. The rise of reform has been prompted to a greater extent by people who, frankly, were alienated from the Conservative Party because, among other things, of their stance on the EU. There are still plenty of people within the Parliamentary Conservative Party who are viscerally opposed to Brexit, still hate the idea. And there are still quite a few of my former colleagues who are very much in favour of it. And that's an argument that has not been resolved. I think it will continue to be a fault line until such time as the Conservative Party decides to find a way through it.
No, thank you. Really, really interesting. Um, and that actually brings us really nicely on to my next question, which is we've talked around the future relationship and how the current government look to be seeking ever closer union once again. But thinking around that polarization of politics and how the opinion polls have shifted and the political landscape in the UK has shifted, and your role as a senior advisor to Reform UK, should we get to the next election and we end up with a Reform majority or a Reform-led government, what impact do you think that has for our future relationship with Europe?
Well, I think that impact is already being felt. Only a few days ago, Jean-Claude Juncker said that it would not be welcome if the UK wanted to rejoin the European Union. He clearly is still personally smarting as a consequence of what happened 10 years ago, and a lot of his colleagues are too. I can't speak on reform policy in relation to what will happen after the election. I've got to make that clear. But as someone who is a very enthusiastic member of reform and someone who takes an interest in the European Union, I think that really the EU have to understand that if they enter into relationships with a Labour Party who are acting contrary or outside the mandate that was given to them back in 2024, then reform should not feel itself bound to honor any such obligations, but to take a look at them, each and every one of them, and decide which of them we want to remain bound by. Um, that is something I think of itself that's going to be a cause of concern to the European Union. And we've got to consider this too. The European Union itself has changed considerably over the last 10 years. If you look at countries such as France and Germany, Eurosceptic parties may well form the next administrations. Jordan Bardella in France, for example, has made it clear that he thinks that the European Union is not sustainable in its current form. The AfD in Germany, again, are very, very Eurosceptic, and smaller countries within the EU too have been expressing concerns. So I think that when we consider the future of Britain's relations with the European Union, we have to consider not only whether there will be a change of government within the UK, but also who will be in charge of the more important countries within the European Union itself. And at this stage, it's very difficult to predict. I think only one thing is clear. There will be changes on both sides of the channel.
No, certainly. And I know later on in the series, we're going to be talking to people in the member states and in Brussels as well to get their take on how that relationship moves forward and what the political change on both sides of the channel might mean for that relationship. But if I might finish on one last question, David, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit here, but in the context of that ever-changing relationship, once again, we've got on the one hand the UK seeking to be a rule taker once more in certain areas. And businesses for a long time have had stability and thought we had a clear direction of the EU on one hand, the UK on the other. Thinking ahead to the next few years, what's your one piece of advice to the business community operating, I suppose, on both sides of the channel in how they navigate that future relationship?
I think they should just carry on trading. I remember shortly before the referendum 10 years ago, I think it was the BBC carried an interview with a wine shipper from Bordeaux. And they asked him what would be the impact of Brexit upon his business, expecting no doubt that he would say it'd be catastrophic. And he said, well, he said, we've been exporting wine from here to Britain for 500 years. And I see no reason why we shouldn't continue to do so. Ultimately, businesses do business. They will find ways around difficulties. What governments should be doing is making sure that their lives are not made more difficult than they need to be. And sometimes I think that the European Union doesn't really understand this. It's addicted to regulation, to making life more difficult. And I find it really quite depressing that the UK should now apparently seem to want to do the same. And, I think that business people ought to be making their positions very clear to their governments on both sides of the channel. They've had too much messing about over Brexit. It's been done, it's been settled. We have now got an independent United Kingdom and an EU that, for the time being at least, wants to remain as it always was. Let's live with that. Let's find ways around it. We trade with the US. We don't expect to be governed by the US or by Australia or by New Zealand or by India or any other country that we do business with. We've acceded, for example, to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. You can enter into relationships that make business easy without actually having to follow rules imposed by a foreign government. And I think that that's what businesses should be saying. For goodness sake, give us a break. Let us get on with our business. Let us carry on shipping wine from Bordeaux to Britain for the next 500 years.
Well, I'll drink to that, certainly, David.
I'll
Well,
join you.
thank you very much for your time today and for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I know we could have gone on for a lot longer, and I'm sure we will on another occasion. But thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Tom. It's been a pleasure.